This video is an effort to explain cognitive functions using the work we've done. Our resource. If you're brand new, welcome. On screen is a page from a worksheet I like. I'll link in the description. Now, there are 8 cognitive functions. TE, or extroverted thinking, TI, or introverted thinking, FE, extroverted feeling, FI, or introverted feeling. These are your 4 judging functions, or the 4 judging functions. I recommend you think of them as knives and hammers. Then you have NE, or extroverted intuition, NI, or introverted intuition, SE, or extroverted sensation, and SI, introverted sensation. I recommend imagining these as nets and telescopes. And for introverted and extroverted, I recommend thinking of introverted as inward facing and extroverted as outward facing. Now, each type is going to have 4 conscious functions: one thinking, one feeling, one sensing, one intuiting. And these functions come in extroverted and introverted pairs. So a type who has TE is going to have FI. A type who has SE is going to have NI. And you can make this ordering and patterning as complicated as you want, but this page from this worksheet right here lists out each type's functions in order. And there aren't that many types, there's 16, you can remember them. Your dominant function is going to be the function that does most of the heavy lifting in your life. Your auxiliary function is going to be spending most of its time supporting your dominant function. I also like to think of your auxiliary function as the thinking outside the box function. When you get stuck in a rut, your auxiliary function is usually going to be the one that saves you. It's the Tom Hagen function. Your tertiary function is your comfort function and your relief function. This is the function that makes you feel safe, relieves your stress, makes you feel comfortable, and for that reason, I find tertiary functions often largely define most people. You'd think it'd be the dominant function, but because it's your relief function, your comfort function, your security function, this is where you're going to be spending most of your time, these are your aspirations, this is your flavor. And this isn't always the case, but it's usually the case. Then you have your inferior function. You repress your inferior function, you hate your inferior function because it feels like it stands in the way of all your other conscious functions doing their jobs. But because it's so repressed and painful, it almost always ends up defining a person. So as much as someone hates their greatest weakness, it's still part of them, and that is who they are. And with work, you can reach a point your inferior function isn't just a vulnerability or a pain. Now, shadow functions are a little bit much. We aren't going to get into them here, but to figure out your shadow function stack, your shadow functions are the other functions that are not in your conscious stack. And to determine your shadow functions and their order, just take the stack as you see it on the screen for your type and reverse the introversion and extroversion. Right, so you look at ISTJs, conscious functions, it's SI, TE, FI, and NE. Their shadow stack would be SE, TI, FE, and NI. But real quick, generally speaking, your first shadow function is the one you want, the one you aspire to but never can. By the way, your shadow functions don't play active tool-like roles in your conscious life. They're more in the background fucking with you. The first one is your nemesis function. Again, that's your aspirational function that you can never really achieve. But gosh, wouldn't it be cool if you could? The next one is your critic function. This is the function you feel critical of in others. So you're very conscious of when other people are, to your eyes, misusing this function or misunderstanding it. Right, so in ENFP, their critic function is FE, extroverted feeling. They're going to be very conscious and critical of people they believe to be fake. Third shadow function is your blind spot function. It's what it says on the tin. This function is not just a weakness for you, it's peculiar in the way you don't even realize that there's something wrong. The function in this spot for you is just absent from your life. It's not actually absent, but it's invisible. You can't see it. And that'll cause problems for you. And then your final function, final shadow function, final function overall is your demon function. This is going to be the function you have the most naked hatred for, and it'll also probably be your downfall. Because although you hate this function, and this function above all others or below all others acts against everything you believe in, it is an essential part of the human experience, of your species, and the more you hate it and fight it, at least without understanding it, the more likely you are to be destroyed by it. Like that dude in Disney's Tarzan who hangs himself accidentally. If you aren't careful, that'll be you. Now let's get into explaining the functions themselves, and we'll start with the perceiving functions. We'll start with any. Extroverted intuition I like to imagine as a web, because it's building an ever-expanding web of information. And to note here with any compared to all other functions is the associations are often more important than the nodes of information themselves. Any is taking all of these little things and putting them together to try to create one larger picture. The larger picture is the goal, and the nodes are the means. And that's why Any enjoys theorizing for fun so much. Entertaining strange possibilities. Not because the possibilities themselves they believe in, but because the associations or the implications would be very fun and interesting. Any is paired with SI. SI keeps the nodes intact so the associations can stay afloat. Because if the nodes fall apart, then the web falls apart, and that's no good. Now we get into extroverted sensing. Now, SE gets associated with presence and living in the present, but that does the function a disservice. It is not just, or even mostly, living in the moment and taking action. SE has an intense awareness of what it's looking at. So it's not just physical sensations, it's also an abstracted awareness as well. What I mean by that, SE catches things, details, slips, other people wouldn't because SE is paying close attention. And it's natural. They don't even necessarily need to be focusing to have this awareness. I imagine SE in the abstract sense as almost like silly putty. You know when you write on a piece of paper with pen, you can take silly putty and press it against it and pull it off, and then the ink is on the silly putty? That's how I imagine SE absorbing information. It is absorbing exactly what it's looking at. And then there is the physical element. SE is a very sensual function. A blue sky, wind in the trees, heat on their skin, or the wind of the steppe in their hair and a falcon on their arm, those mean things to SE types. You might think that means something to other types or to SI types, and it kind of does, but that's more on a sentimental level. SE types are feeling this shit. It doesn't feel pretty to them as an idea, it is pretty to them as an experience. SE is paired with NI. Now on to introverted intuition. NI is like an idiot savant detective. NI takes the components of a situation, things it sees or information, often or always aided by SE, lots of different, totally unconnected components, and it addresses them directly as SE sees them, as they are, for what they are, at least in its opinion, and then connects them all into one larger thing. So where any takes nodes of information about an engine, let's say, and tries to associate the points and weave them together into a manual explaining what an engine is, NI takes all those parts and turns them into this engine. Not an engine, not an idea about engines, but this engine. NI narrows in where NE expands out. And also to note, NI is a background process. Back to the engine example, NI types will stare at the parts and then it will strike them what these things are supposed to be put together. And I note forensic in the infographic because unlike NE and SI, NI with SE can somehow manage to hit a target without a full deck. Or maybe even because they don't have a full deck. NI seems to operate well or notice things that aren't there but for some reason feel like they should be, even though they don't know what they're looking at. NI flies by the seat of its pants, and when it hits big. When it misses big. Now we get into SI. SI is a case-building sensation function. And in the infographic, when I say boring, I mean drilling deep into the center of something. Similar to SE, although, well, they're both sensation functions. Considering you're new, you don't know this. People often act like SI is abstract, away from sensation, but that's not the case. Much like SE, it operates both on an abstract and a sensation level. SI doesn't pay attention to one thing. SI is trying to classify sorts of things. Let's start on the physical level. An SI type realizes they like taking baths. They like the way a bath feels. They're going to fixate on this sensation. They aren't going to pay attention to everything going on around them as it's going on. They're going to focus in on this new sensation they have keyed into that they like, and they're going to try to understand that better. So they're going to take the same bath the same way many, many times so they can both experience this thing that they like again, but also deepen their understanding and appreciation of it. SI types tend to wear the same clothes repeatedly, eat the same foods repeatedly, etc. And they'll experiment with these things, making the minorest adjustments, trying to achieve the ideal bath or the ideal sensation. Or they will seek out things that are probably similar that they can include in this category they have come to like. And with SI in the background, there is this sense of decreasing risk, saving time, and maximizing pleasure. And they'll remember these sensations vividly, like they've been saved in jars. They'll remember where they were, they remember who was there, all that stuff. Like that scene in Ratatouille when the critic eats the ratatouille, right? That's what he eats. A recollection that is more than a recollection. And now we get into the abstract side. Abstract SI takes experiences or concepts and then builds cases. Meaning it'll take, for example, a bunch of different instances of abuse, let's say, turn all of those individual experiences into one abstracted composite experience, and then use that composite, that case, to operate in the future without needing to spend all this time doing the legwork for the individual situation. And that's efficient, but you might notice SI will miss things SE wouldn't, because SI is working from a concept, maybe a carefully built concept, but a concept nonetheless, whereas SE is spending the time on the one thing at the cost of time and at the cost of risk. The introverted functions are always difficult to describe. Now we get into the judging functions. Extroverted thinking. TE operates on two levels, the production level and the conformity level. TE likes building things. There's an energy to it. It likes imposing form on the formless or unformed. And if you're a TI type, something you'll notice with TE types is most of the stuff you would do in your head, they do with objects in their environment. Like Kim Kitsuragi's notebook. With TE, there's also a tendency to need to talk through ideas to codify them. In many cases, TE types will talk to people or do something to figure out what they're thinking. Then there's the conformity side. I use the word convention. They like labels, they like subcultures, they like lingo. Now, this is interesting because TE is paired with FI, which is that function is often described as this hyper individualism function, but in fact, TE types, meaning FI types, very much enjoy their confines, their commendations, their conventions. So when a TE type wants to rebel against the establishment, an establishment which was probably established by TE types, they won't just go and do their own thing totally. They're going to go link up with the rebels because the rebels are how you rebel. If that makes sense. It's very orderly. They're very uniformed people, even when they're acting like they spit on uniforms. The English punk thing, whatever happened there. Extroverted feeling. Effie is like an open window on a windy day, cold day. You feel what other people are feeling. Now, you don't empathize with them. You don't know exactly what they're feeling as they're feeling it, but you can feel the emotional waves or winds they are putting off. And these winds affect you. So if somebody's angry around you, you are feeling that anger involuntarily, like heat coming out of an oven. And even if you're an individual with great control over yourself, you're still going to feel it, and it will still affect you. TE types, or FI types rather, that's not really the case. They feel other people's feelings differently, but we'll get to them. FE can be a sensitive sensor. I don't know how or why this is, but it's very hard for people to hide their emotions around FE types. Even if a person is doing everything externally to mask their emotions, in many cases you can still feel something wrong. Now, because Effie is so sensitive, and because it's sensitive to other people, it, even when it's high in a stack, feels like a vulnerability. Even though, when mastered, I think Effie is the strongest function. You are inherently affected or always affected by other people. That's where the FE conformity thing comes in. FE types tend to be weaker to ostracism. They lack that FI anchor. So because FE types know what other people are thinking and feeling, and they don't want to be ostracized because it hurts them, in many cases FE types will just send back the signals they're receiving so they don't get emotionally shot. Now, advanced FE types can say, fuck the weakness, give me the control, and use those mirrors and signaling to control people on a large scale, but that's not as common. Much more common is the linking up your cycles. Introverted thinking. TI is an individual's sense of if-then, of causality. It's very interested in patterns, the why behind why things happen. And for a TI type, their sense of what makes a pattern is more important to them than the facts quotes. Norm Macdonald, famous INTP, facts often lie, but the truth is the truth. And you'll know you're dealing with TI rather than TE because TI tends to reject appeals to things that are supposed to, convince people for some reason, even though they're wrong. You can give someone 15 books written by the highest authorities about why the sky is red. It doesn't change the fact the sky is blue. And we also established recently TI plays a role in identity. TI types are going to build themselves, their idea of themselves, around what to them makes sense. And again, what to them makes sense isn't correct or isn't necessarily correct, but as long as their chain remains unbroken and optimal enough for them, then they're satisfied. And I'm running into a funny problem here. TI feels like it should be the function that requires the greatest explanation because it's the logic function, but it's really not. It's really that simple. It's if then, and that's it. I will say TI can dig itself into if then holes totally disconnected from reality, because if you're being honest with your if thens, then reality will smash apart everything you think is true at every opportunity. And for TI types, that's crushing because they don't have that. They don't have FI sentiment to hold on to. They don't have TE evidence to believe in. But not knowing is part of knowing. And then finally, we get to introverted feeling. The more I learn about FI, the weirder this function is. So FI has a tendency to make black or white moral judgments about things, especially moral issues, or sometimes they'll play up this gray morality thing, but the thing about gray morality is it's still operating on the black or white morality spectrum. They can't not be fascinated with good and evil. Now, that sort of reduction sounds like it should make things simple, but it's not. They won't allow it to be. Because they don't just make these morality judgments, they think about them long and hard, and they fuss about them. Sometimes they change their minds. It's a process to get that yes or no or maybe. But unlike with TI, they don't arrive at these singular conclusions with if-then chains, at least the way you would think about them. Meaning they do have a process and a source from which these opinions spring, but it's like a bedrock lake or like stone smoke. It's wispy, it's solid at the same time, it's a contradiction, and whatever FI types are communing with, the god of FI, it's as confusing to them as it is to you, except they have to deal with it. And FI types very much like black and white thinking, and we used the terms good and evil before. The damnedest thing about FI types is there's not a consistent good and evil they're drawing from. Because remember, they're getting their information from something other. And that's one of my biggest background mind projects has been for a while is where the hell does good and evil come from? Is that an FI concept or an FE concept? For the longest time, I was thinking FI. Well, I think initially everybody thinks FE, then you get into FI and it's like, oh shit, okay, obviously FI. But then you think about it a little harder. FI types, while all using the same terminology, this good and evil, this black and white shit, none of them agree on what white or black is. There's no consistency between them. Anyway, bit of a tangent. When an FI type aligns their FI moral judgments and thoughts and logic, because FI is a thinking function, of course, with their actions, they feel good. If they do something they believe is evil, or they realize they believe is evil after they've already done it, because that can happen sometimes, they suffer. Not just emotionally, but also often physically. And that's a good segue into the emotional side of FI. For an FI type, get insulted by 50 people, maybe feel a little bit, maybe get a little upset, feel disrespected, and feel the anger on that level, but not feel hurt the way an FE type would. But then you kill a fly and then realize you shouldn't kill flies, and now you're curled up in a ball crying. So FI is less vulnerable to other people, but it's very vulnerable to itself, and FI is its own worst enemy. And then feeling other people's emotions, FI does that, but it doesn't do it the way FE does, like it's feeling the heat coming off of something hot. FI steps into another person's shoes, or tries to, thinks that's what it's doing, and tries to feel exactly what they're feeling in the way they're feeling it. So, as with NI, we mentioned with NI, when it hits big. When it misses big. FI, when it is trying to empathize, if it can actually get into someone's head, get into their shoes, it can feel what they're feeling not as waves, but as the emotions the person's feeling. Which, that's weird to an FI or an FE type. That's a weird thing they can do. But when they fuck it up, they really fuck it up. It's like emotional sniping. What an asshole are you if you miss your target? Like, you see a dude crying in the park and you sit down next to him and you pat his shoulder and go, "Yeah, I know exactly how it feels not to have a gigantic dick." That's not at all what I'm sad about. Although now that you mention it, maybe I should be. Thank you for your emotional support. Okay, this video took longer than I thought it would, but not as long as it could have, or maybe should have if we were trying to get very deep into all the functions. Acceptably mid-level overview. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't.